Have you ever been judged, not for who you are, but for what you represent? Imagine stepping onto a flight, exhausted after years of carrying burdens most will never see, only to be denied the simplest act of kindness, a glass of water, not because of rules, not because of scarcity, but because of the color of your skin and the uniform you wear. What would you do in that moment? Would you fight back, risking anger and humiliation, or would you stay silent, carrying your dignity in the face of disrespect? On Flight 228, one man's quiet restraint met one woman's prejudice, and the entire cabin held its breath. But then, a single act, unexpected, powerful, unforgettable, changed everything. If you had been there, what choice would you have made? Would you have spoken up or turned away? And most of all, how would it feel if you were the one denied? Stay with us as we relive this remarkable journey. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because what happens next is a story you'll never forget. The Boeing 787 hummed softly as it sliced through the night sky. 37,000 feet above the Midwest, inside, the cabin lights glowed with a dim warmth. Passengers shifted in their seats, some drifting into restless sleep, others scrolling aimlessly through glowing screens. It was, for most of them, an ordinary flight, New York to San Francisco. 5 hours of routine discomfort before returning to their lives on the ground. But in row 16, something ordinary was about to turn extraordinary. David Coleman sat quietly in the aisle seat, his broad shoulders tucked into the narrow frame of economy class. He was not dressed like most business travelers, no tailored suit, no silk tie. Tonight, he wore a simple dark jacket over a pressed white shirt, the kind of outfit that looked polished but unassuming. To the casual observer, he might have seemed like any other weary passenger making his way home. But David was not ordinary. He was the CEO of Coleman Technologies, a company that had just gone public 2 months earlier. For years, he had fought tooth and nail to build his company, often the only black man in boardrooms filled with skeptics, doubters, and sometimes open hostility. Outwardly, he carried himself with calm assurance. Inwardly, the scars of countless dismissals and slights remained. This flight was supposed to be simple. No speeches, no investors, no press, just time to breathe. The cabin air was dry, the recycled oxygen making his throat scratchy. He pressed the call button, then changed his mind and simply waited. When the beverage cart rattled down the aisle, he offered a polite nod to the woman pushing it. Her name was Linda Harris. At 48, she had worked for the airline for over 20 years. Her smile, once genuine, had hardened into something closer to habit. Tonight, there was no smile at all, just a thin line of lips, a weary impatience in her eyes, and the kind of practiced efficiency that made her movements sharp and mechanical. "Something to drink?" she asked. Her tone clipped, her eyes already moving past David to the row behind him. "Yes, ma'am," David said gently. His voice was deep but quiet, carrying the warmth of someone used to commanding rooms without ever raising it. "Just a bottle of water. Please, no ice. For a moment." Linda's hands hovered over the bottles neatly lined up on the cart. She could see the water right there. It would have been effortless to twist the cap, set it on his tray, and move on. But instead, she straightened, her chin lifting slightly. "We'll be doing a full water service later, after the meal," she said flatly. "You'll have to wait." David blinked. His eyes dropped to the cart again. A dozen small bottles of Dasani sat there, beads of condensation glistening under the cabin lights. The passenger next to him sipped a Coke that had just been poured. He looked back at Linda, puzzled but polite. "I see you've got water right there," he said softly. "If it's not too much trouble, I'd appreciate one now." Something in his tone, calm, respectful, even deferential, seemed to ignite something else in her. A flicker of disdain crossed her face. She drew herself taller, as if reclaiming authority. "The cart service is for premium beverages," she snapped. "Water comes later. That's our policy." The words hung in the air, flimsy and false. Everyone knew water was the most basic request. The man across the aisle, sipping ginger ale, frowned. 2 rows up. A young journalist named Sophie Nguyen paused her typing, sensing a story building. David inhaled slowly, exhaled even slower. Years of boardroom battles, of being underestimated, had trained him for moments like this. But here, in the cramped quiet of row 16, the sting was sharper. Not because he couldn't have the water, but because of what the refusal meant. It wasn't about the drink, it was about him. A black man in a seat she had already judged. He leaned back slightly, his voice still steady. "Ma'am, I'm not asking for anything special. Just a bottle of water, like anyone else." Her lips pressed into a thin blade of resentment. She leaned closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear, but loud enough that the rows around them sensed the edge. "People like you," she hissed, "always think you deserve more." The phrase sliced deeper than the dry air in his throat. He'd heard it before on playgrounds, in classrooms, in boardrooms dressed up in more polite language. Always the same message: you don't belong. Stay in your place. David sat still. His jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. He simply met her gaze, unflinching, letting silence speak louder than anger. Around them, the cabin grew tense. Conversations faltered. A man 2 rows back shifted forward, listening. Sophie's fingers hovered above her keyboard, her instincts alive. The hum of the engines carried on. Outside, the night sky stretched endless and black. Inside, a storm was quietly gathering. That glass of water was no longer just a drink. It was about dignity, respect, and the quiet battle that had followed David Coleman his entire life. David Coleman sat back against the stiff headrest, his throat still dry, but thirst was the least of his concerns. What stung was not the denial of water, but the old familiar shadow that came with it, a shadow he had carried all his life. As the beverage cart rattled away, David closed his eyes. The cabin around him buzzed faintly with whispers, but inside his head another world opened. Memories, uninvited, rose to the surface. He was 8 years old again, running down cracked sidewalks in his neighborhood in Newark. His sneakers were scuffed, his backpack hand-me-down, and yet he ran with pride. That day, he had earned the highest grade on a math test. His teacher had called him gifted. He could still hear the excitement in his mother's voice when he told her, but he also remembered the sting that followed. A boy down the block, older and meaner, had shoved him against a fence and sneered. "You think you're special? Huh, people like you never make it." Those words had burrowed into his young mind, lodging there like splinters. Years later, in high school, it was the guidance counselor who told him maybe he should aim lower. Not because of his grades, those were impeccable, but because, as she put it, colleges look for certain kinds of students. He understood exactly what she meant. He pushed harder. At Princeton, he learned to code not just in computer languages but in the unspoken language of survival. He learned to smile in rooms where he wasn't welcome, to swallow insults disguised as jokes, to answer condescension with data, strategy, results. Each boardroom he entered as the only black man reminded him of those sidewalks in Newark. The same sneers dressed in tailored suits. By the time he became CEO, David had worn resilience like armor. But armor was heavy, and tonight, at 37,000 feet, it felt heavier than ever. He opened his eyes. Across the aisle, Sophie Nguyen had not stopped glancing at him. A journalist by instinct, she recognized the gravity of what had just happened. She saw how Linda Harris's refusal was not just service gone wrong, but prejudice laid bare. Her fingers hovered over her laptop keyboard. Should she start writing, or would that turn a moment of humiliation into exploitation? Meanwhile, the man beside David shifted awkwardly. James Carter, his longtime friend and one of the earliest investors in Coleman Technologies, had been quiet through the exchange. Now he leaned in, lowering his voice. "Dave," he whispered. "You okay?" David nodded once. His lips curved into something that looked like calm, but felt like strain. "I've been through worse," he said softly. James frowned. "That's not the point. You shouldn't have to go through this. Not here. Not now." David's gaze drifted toward the aisle, where Linda continued her sharp, efficient service as though nothing had happened. Passengers avoided her eyes. A few glanced back at David with sympathy. Others pretended to sleep. Silence, as always, was safer. "She thinks she won," David murmured. James shook his head. "This isn't about winning or losing. This is about respect, and she's wrong." David didn't reply. He stared at the tiny seatback screen in front of him, but he wasn't watching the silent movie trailers flashing across it. His mind was turning, weighing. For decades, he had chosen the path of restraint. Anger, he knew, was too easily used against men like him. The world was quick to label, quick to twist, so he had built his empire brick by brick with patience and calm resolve. But patience had its cost. Sometimes silence was mistaken for acceptance. His throat burned again, not from dryness, but from the words he wasn't sure if he should speak. The plane jolted slightly as it passed through a pocket of turbulence. Trays rattled. A baby cried 3 rows back. David closed his eyes once more, steadying his breath. He remembered the day of his company's IPO. He had stood on the balcony of the New York Stock Exchange, cameras flashing, investors cheering. To the world, he was a symbol of success, of possibility. But when the moment quieted, he had stood alone for a brief second, thinking, will this ever be enough? Will I ever be seen simply as a man, not a symbol, not a threat? Now, here he was, a CEO worth millions, reduced again to the old wound, the old message. People like you don't belong. He turned his head toward the window. Outside, the night sky stretched infinite and black, dotted with stars beyond the glass. He had always loved flying. The stillness above the clouds gave him perspective. Down below, the world was chaos. Up here, everything seemed ordered, steady. But tonight, even the stars looked distant. He whispered to himself, words barely audible over the drone of the engines. "Stay calm. Don't give them what they want." James heard him and put a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to fight alone." "Dave." David gave him a faint smile, But inside, a battle raged. Should he push back, demand fairness, risk the escalation, or should he stay silent, swallow the insult, and protect the dignity he had fought so hard to preserve? His mind played out both paths. In one, he raised his voice, called the attendant out, drew the eyes of the cabin. Would they see him as the victim or as the angry black man causing a scene in the other path? He said nothing. Let the moment pass. Let her walk away smug in her contempt. Neither felt like victory. The beverage cart clinked farther down the aisle. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, but the air in row 16 was heavier, thicker. Sophie Nguyen finally opened her laptop. She began typing, not as a journalist chasing clicks, but as a witness who knew stories like this mattered. Her fingers moved quickly, capturing the details before they slipped away the way Linda's voice had hardened, the way David had remained calm, the subtle shift in the atmosphere around them. This wasn't just about a glass of water. It was about every silent injustice that went unnoticed, unchallenged, and Sophie knew, deep in her gut, that this story would not end here. David leaned back again, his eyes closing, but sleep would not come. The storm had only just begun, and he could feel it somewhere, just beyond the curtain separating economy from the cockpit. Someone else would soon take notice. Linda Harris stood in the narrow galley at the back of the aircraft, her hands stiff as she rearranged cups that were already neatly stacked. To anyone passing by, she looked like a professional at work, performing her duties without fuss. But inside her chest, a quiet fire burned. She had been a flight attendant for over 2 decades, 20 years of serving drinks, picking up trash, smiling at people who rarely smiled back, 20 years of aching feet, missed holidays, and polite small talk that drained her dry. Somewhere along the way, the cheer had faded, replaced by something harder. Tonight had not been a good night. Before she left for the airport, her landlord had left another warning about overdue rent taped to her apartment door. Her daughter had called to say she might drop out of college because the financial aid wasn't enough, and her ex-husband had left a voicemail reminding her she was late with child support for their son. She had swallowed her anger, painted on her makeup, and put on the navy blue uniform that fit tighter each year, but resentment was already waiting at the surface. And then came David Coleman. Linda didn't see a tired passenger simply asking for water. She saw what she always saw in people like him, or rather, what she chose to see. He looked comfortable in his seat, as if he belonged anywhere he went. There was a calm in his voice, the kind of calm that came from knowing you had power in the world. She thought of all the executives she had served in first class, men who waved her off with a flick of their wrist, women who demanded champagne with a tone that implied servitude was her birthright. To Linda, David was no different. She ignored the fatigue in his eyes. She ignored the simplicity of his request. All she saw was another man who believed the rules did not apply to him, and when he dared to point to the bottles of water sitting in plain sight, it was as if he had poked directly at the sorest part of her soul. "People like you," she had said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Even now, standing in the galley, she replayed those words. She told herself she hadn't meant them the way they sounded, but deep down, she knew better. The truth was uglier. Over the years, she had developed a pattern, though she would never admit it aloud. Certain passengers grated on her more than others. A woman in a hijab who had once asked for help with overhead luggage. A young man with an accent who she had assumed was trying to cheat the system by asking for an extra snack. A black teenager who had smiled too wide when she told him no refills, always subtle, always small enough to hide, but always there. It wasn't that she thought of herself as cruel. No. Linda believed she was fair. I treat everyone the same, she often told herself. But what she meant was I treat everyone the same when they know their place. Tonight, David hadn't stayed in the place she silently assigned him. He had looked her straight in the eye, steady, calm, unflinching. That was what unsettled her most. She gripped the counter until her knuckles whitened. Why did he have to push? Why couldn't he just wait for the water like everyone else? Why did he make her feel small in front of the passengers? The bitterness in her chest tightened. She thought of her daughter, of the unpaid bills, of the endless parade of people who seemed to glide through life while she worked herself raw. And in David's quiet dignity, she thought she saw mockery. Her radio crackled with a call from a junior attendant in the forward galley. "Linda, we're preparing meal service in 10. Copy." She pressed the button. Copy. Her voice was steady, professional, but her heart thudded with unease. For the first time in years, she sensed she had crossed a line, because the cabin had gone too quiet. She had seen the faces turned toward row 16. The businessman who frowned, the young Asian woman typing notes, the whispers that rippled like static down the aisle. She told herself it didn't matter. Passengers forgot things by landing. No one would file a complaint over something so trivial. It was just water. Still, a part of her knew the truth. Something about the way David had looked at her, steady and unshaken, had shifted the air. He had not shouted. He had not cursed. He had simply existed with dignity. And somehow, that was more damning than any outburst could have been. Linda rubbed her temples. She told herself again that she was right, that the rules were the rules, that she was simply doing her job. But the voice in the back of her mind, the one she usually drowned with noise, whispered, "You weren't fair. You weren't right. And you know it." The fire in her chest flared hotter. Resentment, shame, anger, they tangled together until she could no longer tell one from the other. And in that tangle, a decision formed. She would not back down. If the man in 16A thought he could challenge her authority, he would learn quickly. She was the one in uniform. She was the one with control of the cart, the service, the flow of the cabin. He could wait for his water. She lifted her chin, smoothed her uniform, and pushed the cart back into the aisle. But she did not notice the eyes that followed her. She did not notice the way whispers grew louder. She did not see the young journalist in row 14 quietly pressing record on her phone. She only saw David Coleman and the quiet fire of defiance still burning in his gaze. And for Linda Harris, that fire felt like a challenge she could not ignore. The hum of the engines carried on like an endless lullaby, but row 16 was no longer lulled. The cabin, once a cocoon of anonymity, had shifted. The tension around David Coleman and Linda Harris was now a presence, heavy and undeniable. David remained seated, his posture calm but unyielding. His hands rested lightly on his knees, his gaze steady on the seat back in front of him. To an outsider, he looked serene, but those who watched closely, and many were, could sense the storm beneath the surface. Linda, on the other hand, moved briskly down the aisle with her cart, her shoulders stiff, her jaw set. Each soda coffee tea came sharper than the last. She could feel the eyes on her, some curious, some disapproving, some quietly supportive, but all watching. She hated being watched. 3 rows back, Sophie Nguyon's heart raced as she typed notes into her laptop. Her instincts screamed that this was more than an awkward in-flight spat. She could see the story forming. A respected black businessman denied the most basic courtesy, treated with contempt before 200 silent witnesses. She didn't yet know what direction the story would take, but she knew the seed had been planted. The cabin's silence cracked first in row 18. A middle-aged man in a gray suit, his tie loosened, leaned forward and spoke just loud enough for others to hear. For God's sake, just give the man a bottle of water. His voice was weary, exasperated, but it carried weight. Heads turned. Linda froze, her hand hovering above the cans of soda. Her eyes darted back, sharp and hostile. "Sir," she snapped, "I'll thank you not to tell me how to do my job." The man leaned back but shook his head in disbelief. A murmur spread like ripples on water. From the other side of the aisle, a young woman in her 20s raised her voice. He wasn't asking for anything special. Show him some respect. The word respect seemed to vibrate through the cabin. Passengers stirred, shifting in their seats. Some nodded faintly. Others stayed quiet, eyes down. The air had changed. Linda's cheeks flushed hot. "Respect is earned," she shot back, louder than she intended. The words came out brittle, sharp-edged, and instantly she knew they had landed wrong. Too wrong. David closed his eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in restraint. He raised his hand slightly, palm outward, as if calming the passengers around him. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried clearly. "It's fine," he said. "I can wait." His calmness only amplified the injustice. He was the one insulted, and yet he was the one diffusing tension. The unfairness stung the witnesses, made the silence heavier. Linda, however, saw his restraint as provocation. In her mind, his composure mocked her authority. His quiet dignity made her fury louder. She leaned closer to him, lowering her voice but sharpening her words like knives. "You people," she hissed, "always think the rules don't apply to you." The phrase sliced the air. The man in the gray suit stiffened. The young woman gasped. Sophie stopped typing and pressed record. No one missed the venom in the words. No one missed what you people meant. David's eyes opened, and for the first time since the exchange began, he turned to look at her directly. His gaze was calm but unflinching, heavy with the weight of every indignity he had endured in silence. When he spoke, his voice was steady, measured, precise. "My people," he said, each word deliberate, "have been building this country, leading its companies, defending its freedoms, for generations. I am not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the same courtesy you extend to every other passenger." The rows around them fell utterly silent. Even the baby that had been fussing earlier seemed hushed. Linda's throat tightened. Her eyes darted to the bottles of water still glistening in their plastic. She felt trapped, cornered by truth. To hand him the bottle now would be to admit fault. To refuse again would expose her further. Her pride, brittle and stubborn, won. "You'll get nothing from me." She spat, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. She shoved the cart forward, rattling bottles, nearly spilling a cup of coffee into a passenger's lap. Gasps followed her down the aisle. The murmurs grew louder, sharper. Words like disgraceful and unacceptable whispered in the stale cabin air. David sat back again, closing his eyes. He didn't press the call button. He didn't argue. He simply withdrew into himself, as though retreating to a place beyond the reach of small cruelties. But the cabin had seen, and silence, once safe, was no longer an option. At the front of the plane, a young attendant named Kevin had witnessed everything. His face pale, his hands trembling. He hesitated by the galley curtain. He knew the rules don't disturb the cockpit unless there's a medical or mechanical emergency. But what he had just seen felt like an emergency of another kind. He took a breath, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the cockpit. Behind him, the whispers in the cabin grew louder. Respect, courtesy, fairness. And in seat 16A, David Coleman sat motionless, eyes closed, dignity intact, but a storm quietly gathering all around him. The junior attendant, Kevin, had already disappeared behind the curtain leading to the cockpit. But David Coleman remained unaware of it. He sat still in row 16, his body a picture of calm, though his mind was anything but calm. The words, "you people," still rang in his ears. They had the sting of déjà vu. It was as if the airplane cabin had peeled back time, revealing the countless moments in his life when those two words, sometimes spoken outright, sometimes implied, had been used to put him in his place. He had learned long ago to control his reactions. Anger, for a black man in America, was rarely seen as justified. It was dangerous. A raised voice became a threat. A demand for fairness became entitlement. And so David had become a master of restraint, but the cost of restraint was heavy. He leaned back, eyes closed, hearing his mother's voice from decades ago. "David, you'll have to work twice as hard to get half as much, and even then, they'll still try to make you feel small. Don't let them." She had been right. At Princeton, when a professor once assumed he was on a sports scholarship rather than academic merit, at venture capital meetings, when investors shook hands with his white co-founder first, assuming David was the assistant, at conferences, when strangers asked if he was security. Always the same lesson: dignity had to be guarded fiercely, but quietly. Tonight, though, the weight of years pressed harder. He thought of the IPO again, and the flashbulbs, the applause. The moment his company name appeared on the ticker in Times Square, he had smiled for the cameras. But inside he had wondered, would this change anything? Would success finally shield him from small humiliations? The answer, sitting 37,000 feet in the air, was clear. No. He opened his eyes. Across the aisle, James Carter watched him closely. James was not just an investor, but a friend, one of the few who had believed in him when others did not. His brow furrowed now, as if silently asking, "Why don't you fight back?" David offered him a faint smile, but his heart was heavy, because he didn't know any more. Every instinct told him to rise, to call Linda out, to demand what was right, but another instinct, older and deeper, whispered caution. He saw the possible headlines: "CEO causes disruption on flight." He saw the comments online. Why didn't he just wait like everyone else? He thought of the young employees at his company who looked up to him, who saw him as proof that success was possible. What message would his anger send them? And yet, what message would silence send? His chest tightened as the questions collided. He remembered the first time he'd walked into a boardroom as CEO. The looks he received: surprise, skepticism, discomfort. He had told himself then, "Every time I walk into a room, I carry more than myself. I carry every young black entrepreneur watching from the outside." That thought returned to him now. On this plane, in this cabin, he carried more than his own thirst. He carried the quiet dignity of every man and woman who had been told "you people." But still, the risk of speaking burned in his mind. He glanced at Sophie Nguyen 2 rows ahead. She was typing furiously, her posture tense, her attention clearly on him. He didn't know who she was, but he recognized the look of someone documenting, ready to amplify. Did he want that? Did he want this moment to ripple beyond the cabin, into a world that dissected everything, twisted everything? He exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. The voices around him returned. The man in the gray suit still muttered under his breath. The young woman who had called for respect whispered to her seatmate, her voice tight with anger. The passengers had seen. They had heard. For once, silence wasn't protecting Linda. It was indicting her. David ran his thumb along the edge of his armrest, grounding himself. He thought again of his mother. He thought of his employees. He thought of the young entrepreneurs who saw him not just as a CEO, but as a symbol. A decision formed. If he spoke again, it would not be in anger. It would not be in desperation. It would be in truth. He straightened slightly, drawing in a slow breath. The words came measured, precise. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice even but strong enough to carry. "I'm not asking for more. I'm asking for what any passenger is entitled to, a glass of water. You've denied me, not because of policy, but because of prejudice, and everyone here knows it." The cabin froze. Linda, halfway down the aisle, stopped in her tracks, her face flushed, her mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came. David's gaze didn't waver. "This isn't about water," he continued. "This is about dignity, and dignity is not something you get to decide who deserves." Gasps rippled. A few passengers clapped softly, quickly silenced by the tension. David sat back, his point made. His heart pounded, but his face betrayed nothing. James leaned toward him, whispering. That was the right call. David wasn't sure. His chest still ached with the weight of it. But he knew one thing: silence could no longer be his answer. What he didn't know was that, at that very moment, Kevin was already in the cockpit, telling Captain Richard Walker everything, and soon. The battle David thought he had to fight alone would draw in someone with authority, with power, someone who still believed in honor above all else. In the cockpit, the hum of instruments filled the silence. Captain Richard Walker sat steady in his chair, his eyes locked on the horizon, hands resting lightly on the yoke. The Atlantic stretched endlessly below, a vast expanse of black water illuminated here and there by moonlight. Flying was second nature to him now. 30 years in the sky had taught him to read the air as easily as a man reads a familiar book. But tonight, his calm was broken. He turned slightly as Kevin, the young flight attendant, stood nervously in the narrow doorway. The boy's hands twisted against each other, his voice barely above a whisper. "Captain, it's Linda, and a passenger." Richard's brow furrowed. He had flown with Linda Harris for years. She wasn't warm, never had been, but she was efficient. Still, there had been murmurs among the crew about her sharpness with certain passengers. He had brushed them aside, thinking fatigue, stress. Now, Kevin's pale face told him this was different. What happened? Richard's voice was quiet, but the steel in it made Kevin swallow hard. He asked for water. A black passenger, sitting in 16C. She refused him, not once, but twice, and then Kevin hesitated, His eyes darting away, she told him, "You people are all the same." The cockpit air shifted. Richard's jaw clenched. For a moment, he said nothing. The weight of Kevin's words sat heavy. Richard had worn a uniform too, years ago. Not a suit and tie, but Air Force blues. 10 years flying C-130s into war zones. He had carried soldiers, carried supplies, carried flag-draped coffins. He knew what service meant, what sacrifice demanded. He knew what dignity looked like, even under the harshest fire. And now, on his aircraft, someone wearing his airline's wings had stripped a passenger of that dignity. Richard turned to his first officer, a young man named Alejandro Ruiz. "You have the controls." "Yeah, sir," Ruiz replied, sensing the gravity of the moment. Richard unbuckled his harness and rose. His 6'2" frame seemed to fill the small cockpit. He looked Kevin square in the eye. "Take me to her." As he walked the narrow aisle toward the galley, passengers looked up, sensing something was happening. Richard's stride was purposeful, his expression unreadable. Linda stood near the beverage cart, her face flushed. She straightened when she saw him, her lips pressing into a defensive line. "Captain," she said quickly, "I was just following procedure." The passenger was being difficult. Richard held up a hand, his voice low but firm. "Enough. We'll discuss this in the galley, now." The tension in his tone brooked no argument. Linda followed, her steps clipped, her jaw tight, in the small forward galley. Richard crossed his arms. The low hum of the engines was the only sound. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. Linda launched into her practice speech. The gentleman insisted on immediate service outside of the scheduled beverage distribution. He implied his uniform gave him privilege. I treated him equally, as I treat all passengers. Richard's eyes narrowed. "And did you tell him? You people are all the same." Linda froze. A beat of silence passed. My words were taken out of context. She stammered. "There is no context," Richard said coldly, his voice a blade of steel. "None. You denied a passenger water, which is a basic courtesy, and then insulted him in front of 200 witnesses. Do you understand what that means?" Her eyes flickered, anger and fear wrestling inside her. He was challenging my authority. I couldn't let him undermine Richard, cut her off with a sharp gesture. Authority. Authority is not license for cruelty. Authority is service. If you've forgotten that, then you have no business in this uniform. Linda's face burned red, but she said nothing. "You are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight," Richard continued. "You will sit in the jump seat in the rear. You will not speak to passengers. You will not touch the service cart. Am I clear?" Her voice shook with indignation. "You can't. I can. And I just did," Richard said, his words final. Tears of humiliation welled in Linda's eyes, but Richard's gaze never softened. He had seen too much, sacrificed too much to allow disrespect under his command. As Linda walked away, her shoulders stiff, Richard called after Kevin. "Bring me the finest water we have on board, and find out that gentleman's name." Moments later, Richard stepped into the cabin, bottle in hand. Conversation stilled. All eyes turned to him as he walked with measured steps toward row 16. David Coleman looked up, startled, as the captain stopped before him. "Mr. Coleman?" Richard asked, his tone softer now. "Yes, sir," David replied automatically, unsure of what was happening. Richard extended the chilled bottle. "On behalf of Global Air and myself, I want to apologize. What you experienced was unacceptable, and it does not reflect the values of this crew, this airline, or this captain." David hesitated, then took the bottle. "Thank you, but that's not necessary." "It is," Richard interrupted gently. His eyes lingered on David's calm but weary expression, on the quiet strength radiating from him. Then, without another word, Richard straightened, clicked his heels softly together, and raised his hand in a sharp, perfect salute. The cabin gasped. For a heartbeat, the plane was silent, suspended in awe. Then, slowly, applause spread soft at first, then building, wave upon wave, until the entire cabin roared with clapping. Passengers rose to their feet, craning to see. David sat frozen, stunned. A single tear traced his cheek, hot against his skin. He hadn't wanted attention, but the gesture cut through years of restraint, years of being unseen. It wasn't just a salute, it was recognition. Richard lowered his hand, gave a small nod, and turned back toward the cockpit. As he walked away, Sophie Nguyen's fingers flew across her keyboard. She had her story, not just of prejudice, but of dignity restored. And David realized something. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in carrying the weight of his silence. The applause slowly faded, but the echoes lingered in the cabin. Passengers looked around at each other, some nodding silently, some still clapping softly, reluctant to let go of the moment. For many, it felt like they had just witnessed something larger than themselves. David Coleman sat still, the cold bottle of water heavy in his hand. He could feel the condensation slipping against his fingers, but his mind was elsewhere. The captain's salute replayed in his thoughts, not as a gesture of hierarchy, but as an acknowledgement of dignity. He hadn't realized until that moment how deeply he had longed for such recognition, not for his title, not for his wealth, but for his humanity. From 2 rows up, Sophie Nguyen's heart raced. She had been covering corporate travel for years, but this was different. She had captured it all in her notes and on her recorder: the insult, the refusal, the courage of silence, and now the captain's decisive stand. She knew the story had the power to reach far beyond this plane. Behind David, a middle-aged woman in a blue sweater leaned forward, her voice soft but trembling with emotion. "Thank you for staying calm," she whispered. "I don't think I could have." David turned slightly, meeting her eyes. She looked at him with genuine gratitude, as if his restraint had given her something she hadn't known she needed. He nodded gently. "Sometimes calm is the only choice left," he said. The woman pressed her lips together, holding back tears, then leaned back in her seat. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Conversations hummed quietly. Strangers who had ignored each other earlier now exchanged glances, subtle acknowledgments of what they had all witnessed. In the back of the plane, Linda Harris sat rigid in the jump seat, her face pale and tight. Every clap, every whispered word of respect for David felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Humiliation burned through her veins, but beneath it was something darker, a raw, gnawing fear. She had always believed she could control the story's sharp words, defensive justifications, a veneer of authority. But now the story had slipped away from her, claimed by 200 witnesses and sealed by the captain's salute. Her mind raced. Maybe she could explain it away later. Maybe she could claim procedure, claim misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew this time, people had seen too much. At row 20, a tall man in a business suit, James Carter, rose from his seat. He had been quiet until now, watching with a heavy heart. He knew David personally, had invested alongside him, admired his leadership, but seeing him treated like this, it lit a fire James hadn't expected. He walked down the aisle, pausing at David's row. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" he asked quietly. David looked up, surprised, but nodded. James slipped into the empty seat beside him. "David, I've known you for years," James began, his voice low so others wouldn't hear. "I've seen you negotiate with boardrooms, hold your own in the toughest deals. But what you just did here, staying calm in the face of that's leadership on another level." David shook his head slightly. "I wasn't trying to lead. I just didn't want to make it worse." James leaned in. "Sometimes not making it worse is exactly what makes it better. People saw you. They saw how you carried yourself. And I promise you, this won't just fade away. It's going to mean something." David's throat tightened, but he stayed silent. He didn't want meaning. He wanted peace. Still, part of him knew James was right. At that same moment, Sophie adjusted her laptop screen. She had started drafting already, her fingers flying. She typed the headline as a placeholder, "A salute at 35,000 feet." It was simple, but she knew it carried weight. The rest of the flight unfolded quietly. The tension had broken, replaced with something else, a fragile, shared humanity. Passengers smiled faintly at David as they passed his row. A man in his 70s, hair white as snow, stopped briefly, rested a hand on David's shoulder, and whispered, "You did us proud." Each word left David both humbled and unsettled. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted it, yet it seemed everyone else needed it, needed him to be the vessel for something larger than one man and one glass of water. Hours later, when the captain announced their descent into New York, the cabin braced for landing in silence. But the silence was different now. It wasn't tension, it was reflection. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels screeching against the runway. The passengers exhaled as one, as if waking from a long, collective dream. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Sophie closed her laptop. She looked back at David one last time. He sat with his eyes closed, the empty bottle of water on the tray table, his hands folded gently. She knew this was only the beginning, and in the rear jump seat, Linda Harris stared ahead, her career unraveling in her mind with each passing second. The doors opened, and the world outside rushed in, bright, noisy, relentless, but for those who had been on that flight, the world would never look quite the same again. The terminal at JFK was alive with its usual chaos. Rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, the smell of coffee and jet fuel mingling in the air. Passengers from Flight 228 filed out, merging into the stream of travelers. For most, it was just another arrival. But for those who had sat in row 16 or even 2 rows away, the weight of what they had witnessed clung to them. David Coleman walked slowly through the crowd, his carry-on rolling behind him. He moved with his usual composure, yet inside he carried a heaviness. The captain's salute, the applause, the whispered words of strangers, it was all still echoing in his mind. He had wanted to arrive quietly, fade into the flow of travelers, but the world, it seemed, had other plans. Sophie Nguyen followed at a distance, her laptop bag slung across her shoulder. She had managed to catch David just before they exited the jet bridge, pressing a card gently into his hand. Mr. Coleman, she had said softly. I'm a journalist. I'd like to talk with you about what happened. I'll respect your wishes, but I think the story matters. David had looked at her card briefly, then met her eyes with the same calm restraint he had held on the plane. I'd rather not, he replied simply. Focus on the captain. He was the one who made it right, and with that, he had walked on. But Sophie wasn't deterred. She had audio recordings, she had notes, and she had 200 witnesses who would remember the flight. Even if David didn't want the spotlight, the story was already alive. In the baggage claim, James Carter found David standing quietly by the carousel. He walked up, clapped a hand on his friend's shoulder, and said, "You know this isn't going away, right?" David sighed. "I know. Then at least let it do some good," James urged. "People need to see how dignity looks under fire. They need to see leadership that doesn't shout but stands firm. If you hide from it, the wrong part of the story gets louder." David looked at his friend, torn. He had spent years navigating boardrooms where his presence was doubted before he even spoke, where he had to prove his worth twice over. He had grown used to silence as survival, but James was right. Maybe this was different. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the terminal, Linda Harris sat alone. Her phone buzzed repeatedly in her purse messages from colleagues, from her supervisor, even from her daughter. But she didn't reach for it. She couldn't. She knew what was waiting: questions, reports, maybe even headlines. She replayed the incident in her mind, each word sharper than the last. "You people." The phrase hung like poison in her memory. She had said it before she could stop herself, before she could soften it. And now it was out there, carried by whispers, by smartphones, by witnesses who had no reason to defend her. For the first time in years, Linda felt small, not powerful, not in control, small. That evening, Sophie sat in her tiny Brooklyn apartment, the glow of her laptop reflecting off her glasses. She typed furiously, weaving the story not as a sensational piece, but as a portrait of a man asking only for water, a refusal sharpened by prejudice, a captain who restored dignity with a salute. She titled it "A Salute at 35,000 Feet," when dignity faced disrespect and found justice. By midnight, she had posted it to her blog and shared it across her social channels. At first, there were only a few likes, a handful of retweets, but by dawn, the post had spread. Veterans groups picked it up. Business leaders commented on the power of quiet resilience. Civil rights advocates shared it with hashtags demanding accountability. By the time David woke the next morning in his Manhattan apartment, his phone was buzzing with messages. Colleagues, investors, even distant relatives had sent him links. His face wasn't in the article, and Sophie had honored his request to focus on Captain Walker. But the details were clear enough. Those who knew him recognized him instantly. James called before breakfast. It's everywhere. David, CNN, The Times, even the morning shows. You're trending. David rubbed his forehead. That's exactly what I didn't want. And yet, James said firmly, it might be exactly what's needed. In another part of the city. Captain Richard Walker sat at his kitchen table, his uniform jacket draped over a chair. His wife slid a mug of coffee toward him, her eyes searching his face. "You knew this would get out, didn't you?" she asked gently. Richard exhaled slowly. "I didn't think about it. I just did what was right. But if it helps people remember what respect looks like, then I'll take whatever comes." His phone buzzed with an email from airline headquarters. The subject line read, "Incident report acknowledged, pending review." He knew what that meant. HR investigations, press inquiries, maybe even union negotiations. But he had no regrets. As for Linda, the morning brought a different reality. Her supervisor called, voice clipped and formal. "Linda, effective immediately. You're suspended pending investigation. Do not report to work. You'll receive further notice." Her protest stuck in her throat. The words procedure and misunderstanding sounded hollow now. She ended the call and sat staring at her reflection in the darkened screen of her phone. For the first time, she wondered if the problem wasn't the passengers, or the pressure, or the long hours. Maybe the problem was her. By the end of the day, Sophie's article had been shared over 1,000,000 times. Television anchors debated it. Opinion writers drew parallels to deeper issues of bias in everyday life. And ordinary people shared their own stories in the comments, moments of being dismissed, moments of being seen. The story was no longer about a glass of water. It was about respect, dignity, and the choices people make when tested. For David Coleman, it was overwhelming. For Captain Richard Walker, it was a storm he was willing to weather. For Linda Harris, it was the beginning of a reckoning. And for Sophie Nguyen, it was proof of why she had chosen journalism in the first place, to capture the moments that show us who we really are. By the second morning, the story was no longer confined to Sophie Nguyen's blog. It had exploded across every platform, shared by veterans groups, business networks, and activists who rarely found common ground. On Twitter, the hashtag #salute at 35,000 feet trended nationwide. On Facebook, videos of passengers recounting what they had seen on Flight 228 spread like wildfire. Even late-night hosts began referencing the salute story in their monologues. For David Coleman, it was disorienting. He sat in his Manhattan apartment, phone buzzing constantly, news alerts filling his inbox. He scrolled through articles where strangers debated his dignity, his restraint, his identity. Some framed him as a hero of patience, others as a symbol of injustice. Few remembered he was also a CEO, a man with a business to run. James Carter stopped by that afternoon, bringing bagels and coffee. "You need to eat," he said, placing the food on the table. David rubbed his temples. "I didn't ask for this, I just wanted water, and that's why it matters," James countered. Because it wasn't about water. It was about everything people carry into moments like that. Your calm lit a match, and the captain's salute made it a fire. David shook his head. "Do you know how exhausting it is to always be someone's symbol, to never just be a man on a plane?" James didn't answer. He knew David was right. Across town, Captain Richard Walker sat in a boardroom at Global Air headquarters. The walls were glass, the table sleek and cold, but the mood was tense. 3 executives, 2 HR representatives, and the head of public relations stared at him from across the table. "Captain Walker," one executive began, voice carefully neutral. "We've received thousands of messages praising your actions, but we've also received legal concerns. Ms. Harris has filed a complaint alleging workplace hostility. She claims you humiliated her publicly." Richard's jaw tightened. "She humiliated herself. I upheld the standards of this airline." The PR head raised a hand. "We understand. And privately, many of us agree. But this isn't just about right or wrong. It's about liability." Richard leaned forward, his voice steady. If doing what's right exposes us to liability, then maybe we need to ask what kind of company we're running." The room fell silent. The HR director scribbled notes. Meanwhile, Linda Harris sat in her small apartment, blinds drawn. She hadn't slept. Her phone vibrated with calls from unknown numbers, voicemail she refused to check, online. Her name had surfaced, leaked by a passenger who had recognized her badge. She scrolled through thousands of comments, most filled with fury. Some threatened her, others mocked her. Her daughter called in tears. "Mom, why is everyone saying you hate people? Why is our name on TV?" Linda closed her eyes, guilt pressing against her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. She wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that people didn't know her, didn't know the years she had spent working flights, the stress she had carried. But the truth whispered back they had seen enough. At the same time, Sophie Nguyen was overwhelmed in her own way. Her blog, once a modest corner of the internet, had crashed twice under the flood of traffic. Now she fielded calls from CNN, NPR, and the New York Times. Her voicemail overflowed with interview requests. Yet with the attention came doubt. Was she exploiting David's story? Was she turning one man's humiliation into her career breakthrough? She stared at her notes, at David's quiet plea to focus on the captain. She had honored it, but the world wanted more. That evening, Global Air finally released a statement. "We are aware of the incident that occurred on Flight 2T8. We deeply regret the experience of our passenger and commend Captain Richard Walker for his professionalism. The flight attendant involved has been suspended pending investigation." The statement spread instantly, but so did criticism. Commentators called it too little, too late. Others praised the airline for acknowledging the captain's leadership. The debate only fueled the fire. In the middle of it all, David received a call from a number he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, he answered, "Mr. Coleman." The voice was calm, official. "This is Special Agent Laura Thompson with the Federal Aviation Administration. We're conducting a review of the incident on Flight 228. We'd like to schedule a statement with you." David pinched the bridge of his nose. "Is this really necessary? I'm afraid so." Agent Thompson replied, "When events like this go public, they affect not only passengers but federal guidelines. Your cooperation would help us ensure accountability." David agreed reluctantly. After the call, he sat staring at the city skyline. All he had wanted was to return home quietly. Now he was at the center of a storm that seemed to grow bigger by the hour. That night, he turned on the TV. A panel of commentators debated his actions. One praised his composure. Another questioned whether the incident had been exaggerated. A third said the real story was the captain's salute, not the refusal of water. David turned the volume down. He didn't need strangers defining his experience. He already knew what had happened. He had lived it. But somewhere deep inside, a question stirred if this firestorm could spark change. Real change. Was it worth enduring the spotlight he never wanted in a small apartment across town? Linda Harris stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her face looked older, harsher than she remembered. She whispered to herself, "I'm not the villain. I'm not." But for the first time, she wasn't sure if she believed it, and far above, in the quiet of his home office, Captain Walker wrote a statement of his own. Not for the airline, not for the press, for himself. He wrote about respect, about service, about what authority should mean. He didn't know if anyone else would ever read it. But he knew one thing with certainty: the world needed more salutes and fewer dismissals. The third day, after Flight 228, the media storm took a darker turn. Until now, most headlines had focused on Captain Walker's salute and David Coleman's composure. But journalists, hungry for every angle, began digging deeper. They wanted to know more about the people behind the story, and, inevitably, their spotlight turned to Linda Harris. Her name had already surfaced online, posted by an anonymous passenger who had taken a photo of her badge during the flight. Now, reporters were combing through public records, old co-workers, even social media posts that had long been forgotten. By noon, local news stations were running segments titled, "Who is Linda Harris?" They showed stock images of her smiling in uniform from a company newsletter years ago, but alongside them were comments from former passengers who claimed they had also felt dismissed by her. Passengers who remembered sharp words or cold treatment that had once seemed trivial. One interviewee, a young black man, appeared on screen saying, "She made me feel like I didn't belong, like I was trying to get something I hadn't earned. I let it go back then. But now, seeing what happened on that flight, it makes sense." Linda sat in her living room, blinds drawn, watching the coverage with her hands trembling. Each word cut deeper. She felt stripped bare, judged by people who had never walked in her shoes. Her daughter, Emma, burst into the apartment that evening, her face red from crying. "Mom, it's everywhere. Kids at school are talking about it. They're saying my mom's a racist. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Linda's chest tightened. "Emma, I didn't mean it like that. I was under pressure." Emma shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You did mean it. You said things like that before, just not where anyone could hear. And now everyone knows." Linda's words stuck in her throat. She reached out, but Emma pulled away, retreating to her room and slamming the door. For the first time, Linda couldn't hide behind her excuses. The mask she had worn for years of being merely tough or strict was crumbling. Meanwhile, Sophie Nien sat in a crowded newsroom, surrounded by editors who had finally recognized her talent. Her original piece had been republished by major outlets, and now they wanted follow-ups. "You've got the voice," her editor told her. "The way you captured the dignity in that moment, it resonated. But readers are asking, why did this happen? Who is this flight attendant? What made her snap like that?" Sophie hesitated. She had notes, leads she hadn't pursued yet, whispers of personal debts, family troubles, long simmering resentment. But she also felt the ethical weight. Exposing Linda completely would destroy what little was left of her privacy. That night, Sophie walked home through the Brooklyn streets, the cold air clearing her head. She asked herself what kind of journalist she wanted to be. One who tore people down, or one who illuminated truths so society could see itself more clearly. She thought of David Coleman's face when he said, "Focus on the captain." He hadn't wanted revenge. He had wanted decency. Back in Manhattan, David himself was wrestling with unease. He had spent the day in meetings with his board, all of whom congratulated him for his composure. Some suggested leveraging the attention for the company's image. "This is good PR," one executive said. David bristled. It wasn't PR. It was my life. It was humiliation. At home that evening, he sat by the window, city lights glittering below. His phone buzzed with yet another message, this time from Sophie. She wrote, Mr. Coleman, I want you to know I'm being careful. The world wants a villain, but I don't think this is just about villains. It's about what we all choose to see or ignore. I'll tell the story with integrity." David read the message twice. Then he set the phone down. Somewhere deep inside, he felt relief. As the week went on, more revelations about Linda surfaced. A reporter uncovered that she had once filed a grievance against the airline, claiming she was unfairly passed over for promotions. Another article suggested she had been reprimanded multiple times for unprofessional demeanor. The narrative shifted some, painted her as a bitter employee whose frustrations boiled over. Others insisted she was a symbol of systemic prejudice. The debate grew louder, uglier. Through it all, Captain Richard Walker remained steadfast. When reporters camped outside his home, he gave only one statement: "Respect is not optional. Not in my cockpit, not on my aircraft, not in life." The clip went viral, further cementing him as a figure of integrity. And yet, Richard himself felt the strain. The airline pressured him to soften his words, to keep future comments aligned with company messaging, but he refused. Quietly, firmly, he told his wife, "If they fire me for doing the right thing, so be it." By the end of the week, Flight 228 was no longer just a flight. It was a national conversation about race, about dignity, about leadership. Linda Harris sat alone, scrolling through endless comments, some cruel, some cuttingly truthful. The world saw her as the villain, but in her silence, for the first time, she wondered if the world was right. David Coleman sat alone in his office late into the night, the glow of the city seeping in through the tall glass windows. The hum of traffic far below was a constant reminder of the world that kept moving, no matter how heavy his own thoughts weighed. On the mahogany desk before him lay his phone, buzzing every few minutes with messages he had stopped checking. Requests for interviews, invitations to speak at conferences, statements drafted by his company's PR team. Everyone wanted something from him. Everyone wanted his voice, but David wasn't sure he wanted to give it. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. His mind drifted back to that moment on the plane, when he had simply asked for water. It should have been nothing, a forgettable request on a forgettable flight. Yet it had become a symbol, one he never volunteered to carry. The problem with symbols, he thought, was that people no longer saw the man beneath them. A knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. James Carter stepped in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you'd still be here." David offered a tired smile. "You figured right." James sat across from him, sliding one of the cups over. "You know I've got your back." "Right. Whatever you decide to do." David nodded, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "That's just it. James, I don't know what to do. If I speak, I become the story. If I stay silent, people will say I'm letting it slide. Either way, it feels like I lose." James leaned forward. "Maybe it's not about winning or losing. Maybe it's about choosing what you can live with." David sighed. He thought of his employees, of the young black professionals who looked up to him as proof that barriers could be broken. He thought of his daughter, who once asked him why people sometimes looked at them differently in restaurants. He thought of the passengers on that flight, the woman who whispered, "Thank you for staying calm." Could he really stay silent the next morning? He met Sophie Yen at a small cafe near Union Square. She had asked for 5 minutes, no more. "I know you didn't want to be the focus." Sophie began, her voice steady but gentle, and I've respected that. But the conversation is shifting. People are asking not just about the captain, but about you, about how you carried yourself, and whether you'll say anything now. David stirred his coffee. Silent. I want you to know, Sophie continued, you don't owe anyone your story, but sometimes speaking helps not just you, but others who don't get heard. David looked at her, measuring her sincerity. She didn't look hungry for a scoop. She looked hopeful. I don't want to be a martyr, he said finally. You don't have to be, Sophie replied. You just have to be honest. That night, David sat at his dining table with a blank sheet of paper. He wrote words, crossed them out, wrote them again. His thoughts tangled between anger and restraint, between exhaustion and duty. He remembered his father's advice, spoken long ago. Son, sometimes silence protects you, but sometimes silence protects the wrong things. The clock ticked past midnight. David put down his pen and stared at what he had written. What happened on the Flight 228 was not about water. It was about dignity. It was about whether we choose to see each other as equals, or choose to let prejudice disguise itself as policy. I did not want to be part of this story, but if my silence allows it to be repeated, then I cannot remain silent. His hand trembled slightly as he read the words aloud. They didn't sound like a speech. They sounded like truth. The following morning, David met James at his office. He slid the paper across the desk. James read it, his eyes softening. This is it, David. This is you. Not the CEO, not the symbol. Just you. David nodded slowly. Then let's share it. When the statement went live on his company's official website and social media, the response was immediate. Thousands of comments flooded in within minutes, messages of support, of gratitude, of recognition. Some said they had experienced the same kind of dismissal and now felt seen. Others simply thanked him for his strength. But there were critics too, voices that dismissed his words as exaggeration, that insisted the captain's salute was the only story worth telling. David read a few, then stopped. He reminded himself he hadn't spoken for them. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, David walked along the Hudson River, the cool air brushing against his face. For the first time since the flight, he felt a weight lift, not gone, but lighter. He had chosen. He had spoken. In another part of the city, Linda Harris watched his statement on her laptop. Her chest ached as she read his words, simple yet piercing. She thought of her own daughter's tears, of the look in David's eyes when she had dismissed him. She wanted to slam the computer shut, to block it all out, but she didn't. She read every line, and for the first time, she wondered what it would mean to admit she was wrong. And, far away in his quiet home, Captain Richard Walker read the statement too. He smiled faintly, pride stirring in his chest. He had known from the moment he saluted David that the man carried a strength deeper than most could see. Now the world was seeing it too. The story was no longer just his. It was theirs, carried forward by courage, by truth, by the weight of a voice finally spoken. Weeks had passed since Flight 228, but the echoes of that night still rippled through lives and headlines alike. What began as a glass of water had grown into a national conversation about dignity, leadership, and the power of restraint. David Coleman returned to his work, though nothing felt quite the same. At board meetings, his colleagues looked at him differently, not just as a CEO, but as a man who had stood quietly and firmly for something larger. Employees stopped him in the hallways, some with tears in their eyes, thanking him for speaking words they had long kept inside. Yet David stayed humble. He never claimed heroism. "I was thirsty," he would say simply. But those who knew him, those who had watched his statement spread across the country, understood that thirst had revealed something deeper, a hunger for respect. One afternoon, his daughter joined him at the office. She was 10. Her eyes wide as she looked around the towering skyscraper. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve, "is it true the captain saluted you?" David knelt down, smiling gently. "Yes, sweetheart, he did." Why, she asked. David thought carefully. Then he answered, "Because sometimes showing respect is the most powerful thing you can do. More powerful than shouting, more powerful than being angry. A salute says, 'I see you, I honor you.'" His daughter nodded slowly, as if storing the lesson in her heart. Across the city, Captain Richard Walker continued flying. His name had become synonymous with integrity, though he often brushed off the praise. "I just did my job," he told reporters whenever pressed, but privately, he carried a quiet pride. On a flight weeks later, as passengers boarded, a man in uniform paused by the cockpit, saluted him first, and said, "You reminded us all what leadership looks like." Richard returned the salute, his chest tightening. He realized then that his gesture to David had not ended on Flight 228. It had multiplied, passed from hand to hand, salute to salute, respect to respect. For Sophie Nguyen, life had changed as well. Her article had opened doors she never expected. She was now writing regularly for a major newspaper, her name recognized in circles that once dismissed her. But more important than career was the clarity she had gained. Journalism, she now knew, wasn't about clicks or fame. It was about truth with humanity, and she had found her voice in telling the story of another's. As for Linda Harris, her world was quieter now, painfully so. The airline had concluded its investigation. Officially, she was terminated. Unofficially, she knew she had lost more than a job. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors looked at her with suspicion. Even Emma kept her distance, anger simmering beneath every word. One rainy evening, Linda sat at her kitchen table, staring at a blank apology she had tried to write countless times. She had rehearsed excuses, explanations, pleas, but none of them felt honest. At last, she picked up the pen again and wrote 2 simple words. "I'm sorry." Emma found the note later, tucked into her backpack. Reading it, she didn't cry. She didn't forgive instantly. But for the first time, she believed her mother might be trying to change. And maybe that was a beginning. The final turn came when David received an unexpected letter. It arrived at his office, addressed by hand. Inside was a short message, "Mr. Coleman, I was on Flight 228. I didn't say anything then, but I want to say it now. Thank you. Your calm gave me courage. The captain's salute gave me hope. Because of that, I decided to stand up for myself at work for the first time in years. It may seem small, but to me it was everything. Respectfully, a fellow passenger." David read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his drawer. He realized then that the true power of that flight wasn't in the headlines or the hashtags. It was in the quiet changes, the unseen ripples in lives he would never know. Months later, David found himself back on a plane, this time bound for California for a conference. As he settled into his seat, the attendant approached with a warm smile and asked if he wanted water. He looked up, heart tightening with the memory. Then he smiled softly. "Yes, thank you." She returned a moment later, handing him the glass without hesitation, without judgment, just simple kindness. And in that moment, David understood something. Not every flight would carry a lesson, not every journey would demand courage, but sometimes the smallest gestures, a glass of water, a salute, could change the course of lives. As the plane ascended into the clouds, David closed his eyes. The world was still imperfect. There would still be prejudice, still be moments that tested dignity, but he carried with him the knowledge that respect could rise higher than disdain, that honor could outlast humiliation, and that silence, when finally broken, could heal more than it hurt. And somewhere in another city, Linda Harris sat with her daughter, trying to mend what she had broken. Sophie continued writing stories that mattered. Captain Walker kept flying, saluting quietly in his heart. But for the passengers of Flight 228, for those who had witnessed a single salute at 35,000 feet, life would never quite look the same, because they had all seen it the moment when dignity stood taller than prejudice, and a simple salute became a beacon, a salute that lived not just in the sky, but beyond it. This story is not just about an argument on a plane. It is about dignity, compassion, and the unseen weight people carry with them every day. David Coleman asked for nothing more than water, yet what he truly sought was respect, the kind each of us deserves regardless of color, status, or title. The lesson is simple, but profound. Small actions matter. A refusal can wound, but a gesture of kindness can heal. Captain Walker's salute reminds us that leadership is not about authority, but about humanity seeing another person's worth and honoring it. For those of us who have lived long enough to face hardship, we know that respect cannot be demanded, only given freely. This story calls us to reflect in our daily lives. Are we lifting others up or quietly tearing them down? When faced with prejudice or cruelty, we may not control the world's choices, but we can always choose our response. And sometimes, one calm voice or one respectful gesture is enough to change the room or even the world. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful story. If it touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of courage, dignity, and hope to life. Together, let's keep reminding the world that respect is something everyone deserves.